Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the L. Ron Hubbard Theater in Hollywood, California. Tonight we present a live broadcast of the Golden Age Radio Hour featuring L. Ron Hubbard's adventure story, The Trail of the Red Diamonds.
I first ran across the trail in a hospital. As souvenirs of a war, I'd collected 2 bullet holes and a case of malaria. And I was certainly in no condition to go racing off to China the way I did. The doctors told me so, and my friends threw up their hands in horror. But that didn't deter me. The urge was too strong. I felt that if I didn't go, I'd be eaten up by the gnawing determination to find the red diamonds of Kublai Khan. I'd come across an original manuscript of Marco Polo's. The man that lent it to me did not know its value, and even when I told him, he laughed at me. I had plenty of money, and I didn't need his help, but even so, I had him lined up for a cut in the event of success. Most copies of Marco Polo's travels leave out a great deal. They have to because it's difficult to decipher and it's even more difficult to translate. But for my own amusement, I'd been working on it for almost a month while laid up. Halfway through the volume, I read a paragraph about a chest of fabulous red stones, which glittered like the sun through red-stained quartz. Stones which would cut even metal. At first I thought he meant rubies. Then on further description I understood that he could mean diamonds, and only diamonds. Red diamonds. The things were worth millions, many millions. My appetite for the unusual was whetted by that paragraph. I made a note of it for later reference, and it was a good thing that I did. Otherwise, I might never have connected it with another later item. Further on in the book, the famous traveler stated that the beliefs of the Asiatics were scarcely understandable to Western minds. He stated further that his host, the Emperor of Asia, Kublai Khan, had requested the chest of glittering red stones be buried with him to light his way to heaven and to serve offerings to the gods. Now, Marco Polo, in his painstaking way, had covered years in the writing of the book, but the 2 remarks were far apart in inscription. Months had passed, perhaps. Well, suddenly, I saw the light. I sat straight up in bed, gripping the tattered pages in both hands, shivering with excitement. I was wholly unconscious of my weakened condition. I saw only one thing: a chest of red diamonds in the grave of Kublai Khan. I threw the covers back and yelled for my clothes. If Kublai Khan's grave were still intact, it meant that a fortune in rare stones had laid untouched for centuries. And I meant to be the first man there, whether I was sick or well. An hour later, I was in a telegraph station writing a cable to Jim Lang in China. I used a code book that 5 of us carried. Jim Lang and the other 3 had been with me in South America, and we had promised when we separated that when anything good turned up, we would let the one nearest to the scene know. As luck would have it, Jim Lang was in Peking. I had no qualms about setting the whole thing down baldly. No one would ever know what I wrote. Besides, the code was so condensed that the entire message, including the address, only took 8 words. I told Jim to get a caravan of camels together and to assemble a company of soldiers, and I knew that he would. Bolstered by excitement, I flew across the continent and sailed from Seattle. 18 days later, I was in Kobe, Japan, negotiating a passage on a tub of rust across the Yellow Sea. 5 days after that, I stood outside the railway station at Taku, awaiting the doubtful arrival of a train to Peking. A cold, bitter wind was sweeping down from the Gobi, hundreds of miles to the north. Curls of yellow dust swooped around the station's brick. Beggars tugged at my trouser leg, whining for pennies. Soldiers lounged against their baggage, stoically waiting for the train. I asked the station agent, a wizened Chinese, when the train would come.
Oh, right away. Maybe tomorrow morning. Maybe next month. Bandits bad netting. Bad.
And that was all I could get out of him. Now, if you've ever been in that hole they call Taku, you'll understand what I was up against. I was racked with excitement. In spite of the wind, I was sweating. And in spite of the sweat, I felt that someone was pouring ice water down my spine. Malaria leaves you that way. There were no hotels. The station was so filthy that a man couldn't find a place to lie down. But even so, at midnight, I was so tired, I was almost ready to flop in the middle of the platform, coolies and beggars notwithstanding. It was then that the young Chinese officer in the green overcoat approached me. It was dark. I couldn't see his face. But by the light from the station window, he could see that I was American. He asked me if I wanted to go to a hotel. He said that he had just received word from upcountry that the train would not be there until late afternoon. He looked at me more closely.
What's the matter? You belong sick?
I'm all right. Where's your hotel? I let him lead me across the tracks toward a cluster of lights, which appeared to be the main part of the 10-house town. When we were 100 yards away from the station, I could see him only by the green light of a switch. Then he whirled on me. His stature seemed to double. His hand darted out and caught us at the trench coat. I should have been prepared for that, but I was not. Weak and cold and tired, it took me an instant to collect my wits, and that instant was enough for him. His right hand snapped toward my shirt pocket, and something thin and flat and square came away from with a rending of the cloth. His left fist smashed me in the mouth, and I staggered back, trying to keep my balance, tripping over my ties. The whole thing took place in a split second. Then he was running, a vague, flitting shadow in the night. I dropped to the knees and I clawed at my side pockets. 2 .25 automatics were there. I choked both of them out and emptied them as fast as I could, pulling the triggers. But I knew I hadn't hit him. I knew he'd gotten away. There was little use in following him. I knew also that I'd meet him some other place. Crouching in the dark, I felt my pockets to see what was gone. I searched slowly at first, and faster, and frantically. My code book. He'd gotten it. The wind was cold on my teeth. I was swearing in 4 languages. In a few minutes, I heard feet and saw the sweep of lanterns coming toward me. The French colonial troops were swarming down from their barracks, called out by one of the 14 shots I fired. I didn't want to meet the French, and I'd been a fool for firing at all. Another sound clashed with the voices, pounding boots. The train was whistling through the yards down the track which I stood. I ran toward it. An officer with a flashlight howled at me to stop, but I kept on. The engine clattered past, then a car. The train slowed for the station, and I swung aboard. In a compartment, I reloaded the guns, shoved them into my pockets. I drew up my coat collar, and I slumped down in the seat. If they saw me through the windows, they didn't come in. They knew it was useless to search that train, and besides, the railway is touchy about foreign troops. I sent a porter out after my luggage before we pulled out. At dawn, I was watching my rickshaw boy negotiate traffic through Great North Gate of Peking. My time is limited here. I can only cover the high points. Accordingly, I must pick up the thread of the narrative 5 days after my arrival in the red wall, dust-carpeted Peking. Jim Lang was at the Hotel du Nord. The Du Peking and the wagon lit were preferable, perhaps, but they were too much in evidence. And in the Orient, one can never tell who watches. Jim Lang, he was about 40, but he looked like a youngster. His hair was gray around his temples, giving the only clue to his age. He was eternally smiling, ever polite, always the continental gentleman. And he was faster on the draw than any other man I've ever known. He was upset by the theft of my code book because it coincided with the theft of my cablegram from his own room. It was evident that somebody had guessed our mission and was determined to either stop us or to get there first. It was quite possible that the man who had looted Jim's room and the one who'd rifled my pockets were one and the same. Just how anyone could have gotten wind of the thing was beyond me. But our expedition was suddenly common knowledge. News travels fast in the Orient. There is something like an underground telegraph which carries its tidings far. 5 days then, after the arrival at the Du Nord, I was surprised to receive a card from the blue gown bellboy. There was nothing but a number, just number 1. I nodded to bring the caller up. There's nothing else to do. This mysterious number was certainly there on a mission of importance. In a few seconds, number 1 was standing in the hallway, rapping on my door with the handle of his cane. He was an average-looking man with a smooth, unmoving face. He was young, but he looked older than he was. Only his eyes, twinkling, gave him away. He came in and sat down, but he did not speak until I poured out a scotch and a soda for him. Holding this before him, he lifted it.
To your expedition.
I slapped my glass down on the table and stared at him.
Don't be alarmed. I'm not after Kubla Khan's grave, and I don't indulge in coffin rubbing. If you're surprised that I know of your mission, let it suffice to say that everyone in Peking knows.
If everyone in Peking knew, I should have called the thing off. I should have quit, hands down. But I guess I'm bullheaded. Studying him further, I leaned forward. You're British intelligence, that right?
Righto.
Then what business of yours is my expedition?
Don't be alarmed, Daly.
He pulled a pile of identification papers out of his pocket and he spread them out like a hand of cards before my eyes. All right.
My business with you is prompted by a desire to be of help. And also, well, one must have a little something in return for service.
You mean that you want me to bribe you?
I beg your pardon, Daly, but the British intelligence does not accept bribes.
Sorry?
It's quite all right, old chap, quite. The matter I had in mind was of a rather secret nature, but your reputation with the British has always been of the highest.
Always, yeah.
For that reason, I'm giving you help, because I want help. Do we understand each other? We want information from the other side of the wall. Not very much. Just enough to keep us informed of the movements of the Mikado's troops above Johor. It's a rather simple task, but unfortunately, the last 3 men we sent up there have failed to return. You're a good distraction, that's all. I would like to send an intelligence officer with you. He'll guide you across the country, and he'll help you if you should happen to cross any paths with the warlords up there. He would have complete authority to grant you anything that the British have to offer. He would do his own work on the side, and you need never bother with it.
All right. Send him over to the hotel tonight with credentials. We're leaving rather early in the morning. All our camels are in line, and we have about 30 fighting men who are going to meet us outside the city. It's agreed. He left then, and it was the last time I ever saw him. At 3 o'clock, Jim came in, and I told him what had happened. But he didn't seem to be listening to me. His blue eyes were restless, and he kept staring out into the alley below our window as though he wished I'd hurry up and finish what I had to say so that he could get his word in.
I was up to the Hall of Classics this afternoon.
Something in the way that he said that told me that he had found a clue. The Hall of Classics is not a hall at all, but a large courtyard filled with obelisks, or something of that sort, of which the sayings of Confucius have been written.
I found an old Chinaman. He was in there studying to get a higher clerk rating.
Jim always liked to do the dramatic thing, and so he left his remarks hanging in midair while he poured and downed a drink to wash the Peking dust out of his throat.
This old Chinaman was wise, and for no reason at all, he turned around to me and told me that the chart I sought, would be found in the Lama Temple.
It's a trap.
No, I don't know why, but it isn't. This whole town knows what we're up to, and the old fellow was just fishing for a good-sized tip, which I gave him.
You're crazy. That's the only sure way they could get us.
Keep calm. I've been in this country longer than you have, and I speak the lingo. I know a straight Chinese when I see him, and this old boy was one. He was a clerk, and they can't afford to lie. One fib, and their heads go off.
One slip and our heads disappear too.
Admitted, but it's worth the chance. After all, our leads are pretty sparse.
Yeah, they are at that. All right. So long as you say so, I'll go over to the Lama Temple with you and, say, the Lama Temple is closed and has been for years. Am I right?
That's the point. We'll have to scale the wall and get in somehow. But if I were you, I'd stay here. It's liable to be,
Forget it. I'm as well as you are, which, of course, was a lie. At 5 o'clock, we left the hotel and took rickshaws down toward the Forbidden City in Coal Hill. And under any other circumstances, I would have drawn the line. But the red diamonds were like blazing magnets which drew us into incredible complications. They robbed us of our caution and stilled whatever misgivings we might have felt. We were ready to do anything to gain the possession of those stones. Anything. The Lama Temple was gray and foreboding through the dusk. We stopped before the gates. I thought I caught a furtive movement in the shadows across the street, but I was not sure. Besides, my nerves were jumpy. If this were a trap, we'd have to fight out of it with lead, and in that case, Peking would be too hot for us. But I was amazed at the certainty of knowledge which was suddenly seeping through me. I seemed to know that this was the place our quest should start. And then Jim was pulling at my sleeve, and we were hidden in a jog of the wall, pressing against the gray stone, waiting. No one came after us. The sound on the street were the same. Assured, I dug my fingers into the crevices in the wall and started up. Jim helped me by shoving on the boots of my soles. At the top, I did not linger. A man makes a plain silhouette even against a black sky. I threw myself over like a pole vaulter. I seemed to fall for 100 feet. But when my boots jarred against the stone, I knew it had been 15 at the most. Jim thudded down beside me, and we stood there in the blackness, peering through the darkness of the courtyard. The silence was tense. This place was supposed to be deserted, but it was filled with moving shadows. Perhaps they were caused by the waving trees in the wind. But death waited there across the yard. I could feel it. We walked forward on cat feet, watching every movement. My boots sounded like cannon shots across the stone. Ahead of us, something which was neither wind nor shadow moved. I sprinted ahead. The movement was quick. Soft footfalls hurried away. I dived off in pursuit. Jim was behind me, Started off in the other direction, but I was so intent on my query that I didn't notice. If this were a Lama priest, then perhaps I could persuade him to divulge the information I craved. If it were another, perhaps the soldier of Taku, then I had a score to settle. The big butt of a .45 was solid against my palm. Jim was lost in the maze of buildings. My lungs felt like hot coals in my chest. The man I followed suddenly turned and stood calmly waiting for me. I could not see his face, no more than an outline of his body, but I sensed a smile on his lips. I slacked my pace, juggled my gun, and came nearer.
What's the matter? You alasami loco, huh?
I stopped. The muzzle of my gun traveled down. I felt that this must be a priest. Then suddenly I remembered the voice. It was that of the soldier of Taku. I jumped aside. But he did not shoot. Instead, he whirled and he ran toward a blank wall. Stop! But he kept on. I threw the gun up waist high and sent a snapshot after him. The report rolled through the courtyard. Like mighty thunder, the flash of powder had blinded me for an instant. When I could see again, I sprinted forward. Where the blank wall had been, there was a ray of light. Then it was gone. The courtyard, bound in by solid stone, was empty, save for myself. Approaching the wall, I felt of the rock. There were no holes, which might betray a hidden door, nothing but blank stone. My soldier friend had been swallowed up.
Daly!
Then I heard Jim yelling for me. I went back. It was a long way, and I was surprised that I'd run so far, but I found Jim. He was standing over a bundle of something, looking down at it.
We were a little too late.
I looked at the bundle. It was a man. A dead man, a Lama priest, whose robes were drenched with warm blood and whose hands were stretched out in front of him, clutching at unyielding stone. From his back protruded the handle of a knife, a bayonet.
Too late. If we'd been here a little sooner, we might have...
Wait, this was a trap, but they expected only you would come. 2 was one too many for them. They thought to put you out of the way so that they could deal with me alone, and they know that I'm not exactly in top-notch physical condition. That man I chased was waiting for you. Jim nodded and knelt down beside the corpse. Gingerly, he rolled the thing over on its back. The greasy yellow robes were wet and sticky. I saw something in the priest's left hand. In an instant, I had recovered it. A Buddha. He died with his idol. Jim nodded again, and he took the thing from me. It was small, exquisitely carved from ivory, stained brown by countless ages. Jim handed it back. I was shaken with exhaustion and excitement. I dropped it to the stone. There was a dull pop. I stared down at it. Why, my God, Jim, the thing's hollow. He scooped it up once more and felt of the base. He shoved his fingernails into every conceivable crevice, into the creases which outlined the fingers, the toes, into the eyes, nose, and mouth, but the image was still smiling, still fat, still intact. In his anxiety, Jim crushed it between his thumb and index finger. Abruptly, the bottom dropped out of it. Across the flagged yard rolled the thing which was as bright as blood, as brilliant as flame. A red diamond. At the hotel, we went immediately to our room. The Buddha in my pocket felt as though it weighed 1,000 pounds, every pound white hot. When I entered the room, I was so busy with my own speculations that it took me 2 or 3 seconds to realize there was another man there. From his clothes and expression, one would have judged him to be a casual tourist. Scarcely taken in his build and expression when I saw something else, a thin line of red across the side of his throat. He got up off the bed and he set down his glass.
Oh, hello there. You're Daly, aren't you?
Yes, and you're...
The man number 1 sent.
He reached into his coat, pocket and brought out a packet of papers from which he extracted a note.
This is Greg MacDonald. He will help you.
It was signed with the numeral 1. I shoved out my hand and he took it. His eyes were level and coolly appraising, for all his young smile, and I glanced over his other papers and then introduced him to Jim. It was Jim who noticed the blood on the floor.
Where the devil did that come from?
The visitor glanced at it and shrugged. Then he pointed at my hands, which were stained red. He grinned.
I might do well to ask you chaps about it also.
A dead priest.
A dead spy.
He went over to the window. He threw it wide open and stepped back, pointing at the cobblestone alley. We were only about 5 feet from the ground, and I swung through and dropped beside the huddled form. The man had landed on his face. The sight was not pleasant. Skin was yellow and the eyes were black. The man wore a gray overcoat and carried a small saber. I had a feeling that it was my soldier from Taku. Greg MacDonald, leaning from the window, shrugged again when I looked up.
He was here hiding when I came. He tackled me and scratched me with his nails. Sorry, but I had to kill him. And after he fell out the window, well, I was darned if I'd lift him back through again. Well, you know how it is.
I climbed back. Well, this means we'll have to get out of the city tonight. If we wait until tomorrow, the authorities will get onto it.
Well, you needn't worry. I'm sure I can straighten it out with the powers that be.
No, we can't risk that. We found the clue we wanted. I took the boot out of my pocket and I threw it on the bed. Then I pulled the red diamond out of my pocket and let it blaze in the light.
Oh, my heavens. Where did you get that?
That would be telling.
I never saw anything so beautiful as that thing. You mean to tell me you know where there are others?
Perhaps. And I agree with John. We've got to get out of here tonight. There's no time for delay. Somebody else is on this trail. They killed the priest and searched them, and they missed the Buddha in their rush. We found it and,
He stopped. Staring at the back of the small grinning idol, Jim scooped it up, devouring it with his eyes. Then he sighed and looked up at the ceiling as though he prayed.
Not only a red diamond, but also a chart.
He passed it to me.
See that series of lines on the back? That one is the Great Wall. You can guess at the others.
I forgot about MacDonald. I forgot about the dead man outside the window. I forgot everything except the grave of Kublai Khan, except the chest of stones which would have lit the emperor's path to heaven. The red diamonds were waiting for us. Up across the wall, across the plains, through the lines of warring armies stood, across mountains. In my palm, the Buddha smiled. Our camels were waiting for us outside the Hubbard gate. The north gate was, of course, the obvious point of departure, but I felt that we would have a better chance of getting away unobserved if we used the Hubbard. The number of beasts was great, 20 of them, but the very number excused us from secrecy. Ostensibly, we were a trading expedition, moving north toward the Gobi, a long line of grunting, grumbling beasts and sleepy men. The soldiers fell in on either side of us, carrying their guns in every conceivable position. They were late of several bandit armies. We had nothing heavier or faster than a rifle, but with 32 men, we felt fairly safe from attack. That was a mistake. A man who sells his services to the highest bidder feels no qualms about changing flags on a short notice, especially when the side he first chose is losing. Everything went from smoothly running for the first 3 days, but on the evening of the fourth day, just after we had made camp, I scented trouble. 2 sentries stood just on the rim of camp. They were talking in a loud sing-song. They seemed to become more angry with each other each passing moment. Suddenly, one of them struck out with a rifle and felled the other. The victim bounced to his feet. bayonet shimmering wickedly. I jumped up and I started to run toward them. A hand restrained me. It was Jim Lang. I stopped and I turned angrily, trying to shake him off.
Don't approach them. That's an old ruse. They want you to get near them, and then, while you're separating them, they'll turn on you and pick your pockets.
A moment later, they stood back from each other and shot nervous glances in my direction. They looked sheepish. Presently, they resumed their posts without a word. That night, I performed an operation in my tent. I took an indelible pencil, and I traced the map of the Buddha on my thigh. Then I took a jackknife, and I scratched the marks until they bled. It hurt like the very devil, but I knew that it was necessary. I knew also that I risked infection. After I had finished, I took 10% solution of iodine and smeared the square, completely hid the lines. I knew that a little alcohol would remove the iodine so that I could read the map. It was the only thing I could do. After that, I scraped the original off the Buddha, put it back in the accustomed pocket, and went to sleep. During the night, I thought I heard a furtive movement in my tent, but I paid little heed. I would have been wide awake had anyone come 3 feet of my cot. In the morning, the Buddha was gone, but I had the map. I still have it, and I will always have it, until they blow taps over my 6 feet square of real estate. But the map is only in symbols. I alone know the meaning of the lines, know which way is north, know just what the scale is. Twice since I left China, I've been attacked, but I do not think it will happen again. It takes more than fire to bring out the scale, the orientation, and the proper lettering. I didn't tell Jim and McDonald about it. They had enough to worry about. But I did tell them to watch the 2 centuries. For 3 days, nothing else happened. And then we reached the pass in the mountains. Sighted the pass at about 4 in the afternoon. McDonald identified it for us. He seemed to know his way through the country. He told me that it had an L twist in the middle, and that tallied with my chart. He also told me that he thought it would be better if he took a side trip that he had in mind. He didn't say what he wanted to do. Some Japanese soldiers were quartered about 15 miles away, and I expected that McDonald would gather some information there. He was very nervous as he dressed, and I didn't blame him. It isn't the pleasantest thing to do in the world to have to walk into a Japanese encampment after dark. He put on brown dye and a wiry hair wig and donned a red-tabbed mustard-colored uniform. Then he turned his saddle blanket over, and I saw the insignia of a Japanese regiment was embroidered on the reverse side. He wanted to know where he could pick us up if he lived to tell the tale, and I informed him that we would probably push right on through that night. McDonald was plainly aghast.
Well, Daly, I say, old chap, you know something might happen in there. It's bad, very bad. Some of the trail goes along the side of a precipice, and the drop is better than 1,000 feet in one place. You might lose several of your camels. I strictly would not advise it.
If anyone wants to ambush us, this is the place for it. They'd have to make an open order charge on the plain. This is the last pass we go through, and I don't want the sun up there showing us up as targets. Get it?
You mean you'd rather be attacked in the dark?
Why not? Only sound will tell them when we're coming, and the precipice won't make any difference. They'll think twice, whoever they are, before they go rough and tumble along a 5-foot ledge. It'll all be volley fire, and that isn't so effective.
Now, you speak as though you really thought you'd be ambushed.
I think we will be. Some of these soldiers aren't shooting square with us. I jerked my thumb at a grizzled sergeant. Among others, I think he's against us. It would be very bad, a mutiny in the past. But at night, well, you see, they'll think of their own heights too. And another thing, men have been hanging around our fires who did not belong with us. They thought I did not see them, but I did. Greg McDonald sighed, threw a foot into his stirrup, and went up. The Mongol pony snorted and sidestepped quickly. McDonald, a perfect Japanese officer, raised his hand to us in a salute, drove home the spurs, and became a dwindling swirl of dust across the plain. We camped there, resting and waiting. The moon came up, twice as big as it should have been. At first it looked like fire over the horizon's rim, and then it was with us, making the plain fill itself with shadows. The pass looked like a gun sight ahead of us. At the first glimmer, we started to move off. When we gained the entrance of the pass, I went ahead of the scout. McDonald had not told me wrong. Less than 1,000 yards from the mouth, the bed of a river started to drop away like a falling bomb. At half a mile, the cut was merely a deep black hole. The path went up because our way and the river's course parted at the L. We started moving the camels through, and their grunted protests must have reached far. Quarter of a mile before we got to the L, Jim worked his way up beside me.
I don't like this a bit. They can sit over there and snipe us off. I wish we'd thought about it before.
Too late now. Whoever it is that's messing into our business would hardly pass up such a chance as this. Even if he's just one man, he wouldn't find it hard to muster a company of loose soldiers. Do it for the loot alone. I spurred ahead of the caravan. Jim dropped far behind it, urging the stragglers that moved, save our lives. The first bullet came just as I rounded the L. It smacked the stone above my head and went winding on down the trail into the thick of camels. Instead of drawing up, I dug in my rowels. The pony leaped ahead. At my right, I could see the dark abyss. I did not know what lay ahead. I did not know the exact plan, but before long, I understood. In fact, within the next 10 seconds, stone grumbled high on our wall. A vague, sighing sound tripling into a crescendo until it threatened to blast me out of my already precarious saddle. They had started an avalanche above us. Tons of rock and crashed and roared down the hillside. Camels bawled, men screamed, bedlam broke loose behind me. I drew in and flung myself down behind my horse. There was nothing I could do. I did not know whether or not Jim was still alive, and the anxiety of it made me a little sick. But I gripped the .45 and I watched for another rifle flame. Looking back, I saw a camel teetering near the edge. A soldier had a hold of the halter, tugging at it. The shower of rocks thickened. For an instant, I could see nothing but dust. Then I saw the camel start to fall. His hindquarters went first. He scrambled to regain his footing. The soldier fought to free himself of the rein. Camel rocked back. Darkness. And the sound of hammering rocks swallowed them in their screams. Gun flared yellow-white ahead. A shot straight into the blaze. A man pitched out from the cover and fell, turning over and through 1,000 feet. A .45 slug takes him that way. The avalanche quieted to a fitful rumble. The moon was higher now, and I could see that the trail, wonder of wonders, was still intact. Most of the debris had bounced off and overhang, and not high enough to miss men and camels. I did not care so badly about the camels. They were becoming excess baggage. But where was Jim? Last I saw him, running low, leading his terrified pony. He sprinted across the cleared zone and came up to me.
They're all gone.
I knew it before he told me, but the utterance of the knowledge gave me a far worse shock than the witnessing of it had. Get on and ride. They're all around us. We could have barely been seen in the moonlight. We were going fast along that precarious ledge, and we were a difficult target to hit. The thunder of hoofs drowned the sounds of the shots behind us. Once I caught a splinter of a bullet against the rock above me. They were shooting at us. Someone stood on the trail before us. Without checking our pace, I yanked out the .45 and I held it steady. I saw a rifle whip up to the level of my eye. I fired between my pony's ears. A shadow tumbled through space, glittering. When the moon struck, the rifle, headlong down the trail, plunged, with death whispering in our ears, and with death tugging at us from below. The trail leveled and under us and led us away to the plateau. We were far out on the plain before we stopped. I sat with my head on my chest, breathing harder than my horse. Jim came up and threw himself on his mount.
Pretty tough. Do you suppose they'll hit us again?
I knew he merely wanted to be assured, but I felt all gone inside. Sure they will. They did that just to rid us of our equipment and our armed forces. Now they'll be able to take us out with much of a fight. All we can do is to push on hard and get there before they do.
But what about MacDonald?
I guess I'll get along. We can't do anything for him now. Let's ride. Jim mounted and we rode. When dawn came, we were near our destination. And when the light was good enough, I took out a pair of field glasses and went to a high point on land to study the plateau we had just quitted. Everything was yellow. The mountains were craggy, harsh, even in the distance, and the wind moaned through the cleft in which I lay. Never before have I seen such desolate, utterly wasted country. Now, far to the east, I could see a horseman coming. Behind him, about 2 miles, I could see a swirl of dust, which soon became a racing cavalry troop. But the troop could not see the quarry as I could. I studied the man in the lead. At last, I made out a set of red tabs and a yellow face. I knew then it was MacDonald. His eyes were set and his mouth was tight. He was riding for his life, from the looks of things. And in a few minutes, he swung down into a gulch and ran along the hard rock bottom, losing his trail. When the cavalry came to the place, they galloped onward in a straight line. Going down, I told Jim to saddle up once more. I buckled my own cinch, and we rode out to the end of the gully and found MacDonald. They looked about done in.
Well, they found out who I was. You can't fool those little devils. They were going to skin me alive. But I got away.
Somehow, that remark about skinning him alive grated on me. I carried a tattooed chart on my leg, and for the first time it occurred to me that to get that chart, man would have to rip off my hide. I'm sorry. I cannot set down the exact formation of the land about the burial temple of Kublai Khan. If I did that, I'm afraid that a topographical study of the ground would reveal the exact location. But I can tell you how it looked. We found it with ridiculous ease. Setting at the far end of a big gully. Why Kublai Khan had wanted to be buried in such a place, I did not know. I was not well enough acquainted with his history, but I believe that in that day the bodies of rulers were extremely valuable. So much so, in fact, that armies invaded territories to exhume and steal the coffins of kings. For one king to possess the body of another was much like possessing his crown. Accordingly, Kublai Khan had so decreed, I suppose, that his grave would never be molested. He had caused himself to be buried in the most hidden part of his kingdom, and a man as great as Kublai Khan could be sure that his wishes would be carried out even after death. I had expected a pagoda of some sort, but instead we found that the hut had a flat roof. It was all of stone, and the men who built it had been certain that their work would endure for centuries. But they did not build the entire tomb above the ground. Most of it lies far below. I doubt it would be even noticed from an airplane, for its color matches the terrain, yellow. I'm afraid that the sight of the place made me a little crazy. I jumped off my horse and I raced for the low open door, pulling at the flashlight which hung from my belt. Jim called to me to wait, but I dashed on ahead, completely disregarding him. The thought of red diamonds, a chest of red diamonds, was too much for me. Ahead of me, there might lie an ambush. Ahead of me, I'm not a daredevil, especially. But I didn't seem to care. I plunged through the opening, and I shot on my light. I'd expected to see a room, perhaps a crypt. But all I saw was a black tunnel stretching into the bowels of earth. My feet carried me down, but I felt as though I floated in midair. The place was odorous with this age, and I went down the passage, and I could hear the ceaseless drip of water ahead. The walls became damp, covered with green slime. I traveled far. There were 2 tunnels there, and at the fork I hesitated long enough to realize that Jim had not followed me. But I suppose that he'd be there as soon as he hid in the horses. Taking the right branch, I found that I was once more going down. Steps had been cut into the stone, and the descent was easy, though steep. Abruptly, I found myself on the threshold of a large room. My flashlight played over the walls, and then came to rest on the portion farthest away from me. Chills raced up and down my back as I saw that sight. The thing was too utterly real, too terrible, too gruesome. It was an idol, a war god, squatting on massive stone haunches, watching me out of glittering red eyes, who looked as though he were about to speak. His jaw was loose, as though it could be moved. Before him lay a platform of stones with grooves running diagonally down its sides. I knew what that was. I'd seen blocks like that in the South Pacific. It was a sacrificial altar, and the grooves were made for the hot, running blood of human victims. At last, I tore my eyes away from the war god. A passage lay to the idol's left, and I took it, continuing to travel down. How far this lies below the surface, I have no way of knowing. It would require a better civil engineer than I am to determine the twisting depth. The darkness seemed to thicken. Silence reigned. My boot heels on stone seemed a desecration of the tomb. Then another, larger room opened before me. The ceiling was high, almost beyond the range of my flashlight. The floor was level and moss-grown. In the center of the stones sat a rectangle of stone. I knew then I had found the tomb of Kublai Khan, lost to the world for centuries. Perhaps the crypt at one time been decorated with crossed swords, a shield, spears, but these were just piles of black rust now. Nothing was left but the imperishable stone. With trembling hands, I tore at the head blocks. They came away with surprising ease. I threw them aside. I dislodged the slabs, unconscious that I ripped my nails from my fingers, but I did not have far to go. A coffin had lain there at one time, but it was gone. The body of a mighty emperor had been there, but dust had claimed it back. Save for a few bands of copper and a gold ring, the vault was empty. At first I thought the red diamonds might be beneath the crypt, but the floor was obviously undisturbed. It was solid rock. I searched along the walls looking for a niche, but there was nothing. I stopped in the center of the room, staring at the vault, completely baffled. This certainly was going to be more than a one-man job. I thought I'd better find McDonald and Jim. I sprinted up the ramp toward the room of the war god. It's difficult to find. It's difficult to write about what I found there. Even the thought of it still makes me feel sick and weary. I remember I stood for some minutes, unable to take my eyes from the gruesome spectacle. Jim laid there on the sacrificial altar. His throat had been cut. His shirt was tattered and soggy where the killer had plunged a savage knife innumerable times. The blood ran down the grooves to the floor and collected there in black puddles. I had no idea how it happened. I mean, perhaps the Japanese had been there waiting for us. Perhaps the tomb had guards after all these centuries, perhaps. There was no use speculating about it. Jim Lang was dead on a sacrificial block, and all the deduction in the world could not bring him back to life. I guess I went a little crazy then. I don't know what I said. I only know that I dragged Jim's body from that terrible bed and that I found the red diamonds. They were concealed in the altar. Any slight movement of the top caused the entire surface to raise up, though on springs. My flashlight hammered onto a cauldron of red, glowing diamonds. I laid Jim laying on the floor and crossed his arms over his chest, and I went back to the altar and I ran my hands through the glittering wealth. I was stunned. But the diamonds did not seem to represent money or any of the things that a man can buy. They had meant the death of Jim Lang. I scooped up a handful and I threw them from me. They scattered out like seeds, rolling drops of red along the floor. Some of them were sticky where the blood had leaked through the cracks. Everything must have gone blank at that point, for I remember nothing until I got outside. MacDonald was standing by the horse. Bracing myself against the stone doorway, I stared at him. The sight of his familiar face jerked me out of a period of 1,000 years old and brought me back to the 20th century. He steadied me.
What's happened?
Jim is dead.
Dead? But how could he be dead? He left me just a moment ago.
He's dead, all right. And I found the diamonds. Do you want to see them? His eyes lit up. He walked quickly toward me, past me, and down the tunnel. I pointed the way for him with my flashlight and walked slowly after him. Took the right-hand bend and then stopped. I threw my flash on the war god and he grasped. They're over there in the altar. They must have been set there as a sacrifice to their god. MacDonald did not seem to notice Jim. Somehow the lack of interest in the body of my friend enraged me. It was like a blow somehow. I might have argued that MacDonald was used to such things, but I was almost past the point of reason. MacDonald knelt quickly beside the altar and ran his fingers through the glittering mass. He seemed to be talking to himself, or perhaps talking to the diamonds. He looked up at me, and that instant, I was jerked out of my lethargy by the sudden knowledge that MacDonald was utterly mad.
They're mine.
His face was no longer boyish. It was hard and old and vicious. Snap out of it! We're two white men alone in this confounded country. We'll never get out alive unless we stick together. For God's sakes, man, don't look at me that way.
They're mine.
Behind him, the war god's red eyes were glowing coals. There was a similarity between the two. The droop of the mouth. MacDonald turned his back on me and stared into the mass of brilliance. And then the war god spoke. The jaw moved, and the eyes seemed to increase their fire.
There he is! Go before you die!
I stepped backward. I could feel the hair rise on the back of my neck, but the trick was not designed to work. My flashlight sagged, and in sagging caught and held the blue glimmering and still in MacDonald's hand. I shot my fingers to the automatics in my pockets, but it was not quick enough. Flame lanced out from MacDonald's waistline. The slug caught me in the left side, just under the heart. But I was conscious of no pain, only a terrifying numbness. My fingers found the automatic butts. I straightened. The flashlight rolled along the floor, forgotten, but it did its work well. It rested, the icy beam square on MacDonald's twisted face, blinding him. I did not know that he was blinded then, though I know now. I only knew that I had found the killer, firing a slow, deliberate speed. I blotted out his face. Left gun, right gun, left gun, right gun. I suppose it could be called murdered, but he was the man who had killed Jim. MacDonald sagged, dead at the first shot. Limply, he sprawled across the grooves, pouring his own life's stream into them. Above him, from the war god's eyes were thin and brittle. Left gun, right gun. The dead body leaped and quivered under the impact of slugs. Then my magazines were empty. And the click of the empty chamber was my symbol to crumble. Even after that, I fell flat on my face. I managed to inch forward to make sure that MacDonald was dead. I can remember how his face looked to this day. After that, everything was blurred. I must have bandaged the hole in my side, though I do not remember doing so. I must have dragged myself out to a pony, and somehow I must have mounted. Later, I found 3 diamonds in my pockets. That surprised me because I could hardly have realized that I would have needed their wealth back in civilization. One scene will always be with me. I awake at night to find that it hovers above my face. The scene of that room, drowned in powder smoke, with the war god's red eyes glaring through the curling witch haze. What I knew instinctively then, I know certain now. MacDonald was Jim's murderer. MacDonald was not MacDonald at all, but some renegade. In some way, he had caught word of Jim's activities in hiring troops and buying camels. He had evidently followed Jim back to his hotel and had then rifled the room, finding and taking the code message. Knowing that he had to have a key, he found out who I was, probably in Jim's correspondence, and then came down to Taku to wait for my arrival. When I came, he had no great difficulty in picking me out. Americans are few at the port, and one can spot a tourist. He had me attacked solely for the purpose of getting the code key, which he knew I must carry. Why he did not take Jim's, I don't know. Maybe Jim kept his in a safer place than I did. Evidently, MacDonald had but very little money. He obviously contracted with the Lama priest to obtain the Buddha. Unable to pay for it in cash, MacDonald killed the priest and then tried to find the Buddha. When we got back to the hotel, MacDonald was waiting for us. He had found the real British agent there, had killed him, and had thrown the body out of the window after dressing it in the Chinese uniform and coloring the face. Of course, the renegade had taken the officer's paper. The scar on MacDonald's throat had been made by my bullet earlier in the evening. Then, MacDonald left us just before the attack. Wanting us to believe that he was a real agent, he dressed himself as a Japanese officer. He had stolen the Buddha, discovered that the map had been erased from it. He knew, therefore, that he had to kill us to get it. And he did not want to fight fairly, hence the ambush, by which he rid himself of his agents among our men that he could no longer use. But unfortunately for MacDonald, he had run across a patrol of Japanese cavalry and had to ride for his life. He had killed Jim while I was below ground, and he had intended to kill me as soon as he was led to the red diamonds. He tried to scare me out by making the idle talk, a ventriloquist trick, but failing that, he had to shoot me. Well, no matter now. My only regret is for the real MacDonald. We left him, unknowing, cursing, stabbed to death in a filthy alley of Peking. I arrived at a port of the Yellow Sea with the aid of 2 peasants. I don't know how they kept me alive during the trip, but they did, and I paid them well for it. I stayed there in the hospital recuperating. At first, the British were hostile. They tried to hang the murder of the real MacDonald upon me, and I could not send them to the temple of Kublai Khan. I wanted to go back there myself. They compromised by sending me out of the country. It's all patched up now, And I can go back. Perhaps number one had something to do with it. Most of the money I received for the 3 red diamonds has now been spent. I shall go back this year, winter though it is. But this time, I'm not trusting Chinese soldiers. I've already recruited a company of fighting Americans.